Okay, hello chess players. Okay, today we're going to be taking a look at the Smith-Morra gambit and accepting that gambit and trying to get the best possible position you can get with the black pieces. The Smith-Morra starts with e4, c5, pawn to d4, pawn captures d4, pawn to c3, begins the Smith-Morra gambit. Now, of course, if you want to, you can decline this gambit, you can play d5, you can play knight f6, you can turn it into a c3 Sicilian, but the best way to refute a gambit is to accept it. So d captures c3, knight captures c3, and then we're going to develop a piece. We're going to play knight c6, and now white's going to play knight f3, and sort of the critical parts of the theory all start here. Anyways, if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So now, getting an advantage with the black pieces from here is actually a little bit tricky. And it took me a lot of years to understand this because I don't really fully understand what the compensation is in the Smith-Morra. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. White isn't actually up any additional tempo compared to something like an open Sicilian. So why would it be advantageous for white to be down a pawn just on top of not having any extra tempo? Where is the compensation? How can white even claim equality in a position like this? So over the years, what I've kind of discovered is that white does have a lot of tricks in the opening. And because of those tricks, black actually loses tempo without realizing that he's losing tempo. Like, they don't look like moves that should lose tempo, but anyways, we'll get into that a little bit deeper as we dive into the theory. So the old way to play against this line was to play this move, pawn to d6. This used to be the way to play against this, and we're just going to go over the theory because the theory for this is actually really important for understanding probably what the best line is today and understanding how to play the best line today. So we're going to have d6, and then we're going to have bishop c4. And now this is a really critical component of the old theory. You had to play a6 here. And remember when I was discussing, like, white does have a little bit of compensation because black is losing some critical tempo. a6 is actually a critical tempo loss that black has to lose. Now, for anybody that's familiar with the open Sicilian in general, a6 doesn't feel like a tempo loss, because we do play a6 a lot in the open Sicilian. We play a6 so we can later play b5, bishop b7, and finish our development. But in this case, we kind of have to play this move a6. We can't play a move like bishop g4, because there's a threat of bishop takes f7 followed by knight g5, which would pick up that bishop. And we would like to just finish our development with a move like knight f6. But if we don't have in the move a6, after the move e5, pawn captures e5, queen takes, knight takes, there is this move knight b5, which hits the c7 square. And unbelievably enough, the computer just thinks this is somewhere between slight edge to major advantage white. So we really need to keep stuff out of this b5 square, and we cannot allow this move knight to b5, hence the reason why we are playing a6 before we throw in knight f6. And we also have to throw in knight f6 before we throw in bishop g4, because we have this trick with bishop takes f7 and knight g5. So white's got these tricks, and it's making black develop in a little bit of an awkward way. So we're having a6, we're having castles, and now finally knight f6. Now here, if white plays e5, it doesn't work, and that's what's critical. If they play e5 here, we're going to have e5, d takes, e5, queen takes, knight takes e5, and we have the move bishop to e6. And of course this works because the knight defends the bishop, and there is no bishop b5 check because we have covered that b5 square with the a6 pawn. And black is of course doing great, and this is slight edge black. However, white, of course, does not have to play e5. White can play another move, and the best move is going to be a move like bishop f4. Now, back in the old days, people didn't really think this was a problem. Back in the 90s, early 2000s, they didn't really think this was a huge issue. They would just develop with a move like bishop g4. Now, at first glance, it looks like on bishop f4, you can play something like e5. And this is something really critical that I'm going to come back to, and it's kind of weird. You can play a move like e5, and it's one of these weird situations where the exact placement of white's pieces and the exact placement of white's pieces matter on whether or not e5 is a move that yields equality or a slight edge, or something that yields a slight edge for white. Because white's idea after e5 is going to be to jump in with knight g5 and go after that f7 square where you don't quite have time to defend it yet. Now, in this case, you're going to take on f4, they're going to take on f7, queen e7, knight takes h8, and you're going to play knight e5. But here they can just develop, they can play rook c1, because they can meet knight takes c4 with queen a4 check, which attacks the king and attacks the knight. And then when you play b5, they can take it, they can play knight captures b5. You're going to have a captures b5, queen takes a8, queen b7, bishop b7 is actually slight edge white in this absolute mess of a position. It's slight edge white according to the engine. So wild line leads to slight edge white, but the gist of it is you can't get away with e5, which means you need to play something else. It means you either need to play bishop to g4, or it means you need to play something like e6. Now, in both cases, with e6 or bishop to g4, the most that you're going to get out of this position is equality, which, of course, I mean, for preparation purposes, equality is fine. So you can still play this line, you can get equality, and that's fine. But let's go with the oldest move. Let's go with bishop g4. Now, of course, if they play passively or if they play a lazy move here, black is going to get some sort of advantage. But if white follows his opening principles and puts that question to the bishop immediately and plays h3 right away, you're probably not going to get a whole lot. One interesting attempt that white can try is white can try queen b3. And actually, in researching this video, it made me discover why everybody was trying queen b3. This was actually played by Nakamura against Lei Q on chess.com back in 2023. Now, that game did end in a draw, but queen b3 is, of course, a very interesting idea with a lot going on. But even within the game itself, there were so many mistakes. Like in the game, it was like e6, queen b7, knight a5, queen b4, and then bishop takes f3 was played. Apparently, according to the engine, e5 was major advantage black. So this is definitely a game and definitely ideas worth examining, and something that you would have to be careful about if you're going to play this line with the black pieces. But more on that, because we're going to come back around to what I actually think the best moves are for black, and it actually avoids queen b3 completely. But anyways, so bishop to g4. Let's just take a look at the computer best move here, which is h3 instead of queen b3. And now we're going to have bishop takes f3, and then we're going to have queen f3. So here, the best move according to the engine is e6. And now after rook fd1, black needs to choose between either queen b8 or queen a5. And the idea in both cases is actually pretty similar for white. There's actually a pretty clever move that white can insert here, according to the engine, that gives white equality. Basically, after a move like queen a5, white has to play this move bishop e2. And the idea is really clever. It's definitely a computer move. I never would have found bishop e2 on my own. But once I saw bishop e2, and then once I saw what the follow-up was, bishop e2 suddenly made a lot of sense. The idea is that at some point you'd like to pile up with a move like queen g3, but you don't want to allow knight h5. So bishop e2 controls the h5 square, which makes queen g3 possible. And it's also a good waiting move to see what black does for his next move. So like, the computer thinks that best play for black is bishop e7, and then after waiting for that bishop to move, then it takes the pawn on d6. We have bishop d6, rook d6 castles, and then rook a d1, and then rook hd8, and of course the position is equal. White has a little bit more space. I think according to the engine actually thinks it's still very, very slight edge black, which is confusing to me because white has a little bit more space, he has the bishop for the knight, and everything else is equal. The pawn structure is completely symmetrical. So we'll just call this position what it is. We'll just call it equal, because that's basically what it is. And it's going to go towards equality. Now, the e6 line instead of bishop g4 is going to be very similar to that, as it turns out. So, for example, e6, we're going to have queen e2, and now knight h5. Now, the one upside of this line is there's a little bit of poison to it, because if they retreat the bishop to the natural-looking square g3, you can actually get a huge advantage with black simply by taking it. So like knight g3, hg3, bishop e7, the d6 pawn is fully guarded. There's no real way to put pressure on it, and you can counterattack with h5, h4. And this should just be advantage black all day long. So knight h5 does contain a little bit of poison. However, the move bishop e3 seems like we're basically yielding nothing here for black. After e3, you would have something like bishop e7, rook fd1, bishop d7, knight to d4 hits the h5 knight. We're going to have g6, knight takes c6, bishop takes c6, bishop h6, bishop g5, and again, this is a very long computer line. Bishop takes g5, queen g5, and then we're going to have rook takes pawn, king e7, rook a d1, and we would like to play a move like knight f4, but it just leads nowhere. Just knight f4, queen f3, and white holds his whole position on the king side together, and everything is fine. So we end up with a similar situation to the bishop g4 lines. We just play rook hd8, and then, of course, all the rooks will get exchanged. Rook d8, rook d8, rook d8, king d8, queen d3 check, king e8, queen d4, knight f6 is just equal. The pawn structure is completely symmetrical, and we have the same problem we had, from the previous position. So going back to this stuff, it seems like we're not going to be getting anything out of these bishop f4 lines, at least according to Stockfish. So what's the culprit, and what should we try? So What's interesting is this is a really critical inflection point right here, where we have to decide between d6 and e6. So e6 is the other way that people have tried to play for an advantage with the black pieces. And then the old idea is like bishop c4, and then a lot of people basically they want to either play a6 with the idea of knight on g to e7 to g6, or they want to play for something called the Siberian trap, where they play something like queen c7, and then after, say, castles, they play knight f6. And their idea is they're hoping that white blunders by playing queen e2, and then they're going to play knight g4, h3. They're going to use this Siberian trap. And the whole point is after knight d4, you have queen h2 as mate. So it's this fork. It forks the queen and it forks the knight that's defending against mate. Now, of course, the issue with the Siberian trap is white by no means has to fall into it. And that's maybe one of the problems. And every move order that you can try to sort of get to the Siberian trap has its own issues. So, for example, if we play queen c7 and they castle, and then we play knight f6, they can play knight b5, queen b8, and then the immediate e5. And this is apparently a problem. Like, there isn't a great move here. This is slight edge white according to the engine. So a couple of examples would be we could try a6, but of course this leads nowhere. Takes, and slight edge white. White isn't even down a pawn anymore. So this cannot be right. The other way that we can try this is we can, of course, bring this knight to g4, but at least according to the engine, after bishop f4, we have nothing better than a6, and after knight d6, bishop d6, e d6, we could castle, they could play rook c1, and this is slight edge white. And even though we are still technically up the pawn, this is a huge wedge pawn on the d6 square, and yeah, we can break out, we can play b5, bishop b7, but black's pieces fundamentally are a little bit more awkward than white's. And of course, white has a lot more space than black in this position. So at least according to the engine, this is also slight edge white. So another way we can try this is we can try a slightly different move order to get to the Siberian trap. We can play the move knight f6. And now this is maybe a more clever move order to get to the Siberian trap, is to play knight f6 before you play queen c7. Because in the knight f6 line, you are threatening to play knight captures e4. And you would actually follow through with that threat. If, for example, castle's kingside, knight takes e4 is strong here. There's just this old fork trick. Knight takes e4, knight e4, d5, bishop back to d3, takes. You exchange the queens and play bishop e7. This should be slight edge black all day long. Black has maintained the extra pawn and doesn't have sufficient weaknesses on top of that for white to have true compensation. So black should have an advantage here. So playing this move order reduces white's options on how he needs to continue. He probably needs to continue with queen e2. So now the open question is, should we go for the Siberian trap here? Should we play a move like queen c7 and go for the Siberian trap? Well, this actually goes into a much older line that white can try. White can play this move e5, and this is supposed to be slight edge white or equality or something close to equality. It continues with e5. This is a very old line. It continues knight g4, bishop f4, f6 is basically the only move, and then this move knight d5. And also I'll note that knight b5 is also possible, and it's a little unclear, even according to the engine, like which one is better. But this queen a5 is basically forced. Bishop d2, queen back to d8, takes on f6, knight takes f6, and then we're going to have castles is one of the theoretical moves. Bishop g5 is the best move according to the engine. We're going to have bishop g5, bishop e7, knight e7, queen e7, castles, d5, bishop d5, castles kingside. We'll just call it what it is. The position is unclear. Black has managed to maintain that extra pawn, but his development is still extremely awkward. It's not clear how to finish the development of the bishop, and of course white does have more space in this position and does have compensation for that pawn. So he has some compensation for the material here. But this line goes back really far. So this is another way that we can possibly try to play this, is we can play for the Siberian trap, but with this particular move order. And of course there is that final alternative. We could play a6 and we could play knight on g to e7 to g6. But that line also doesn't seem 100% promising. Like, for example, we could play a6 with this idea, a6, let's say castles, and then we could play knight on g to e7. And then we got a lot of games here that continue with bishop g5 and some other ideas. But if you look at this with the engine doesn't really give much better than equality for black, even though, of course, this is a very reasonable attempt to try to go for something. It's not so clear how black gets anything better than equality. But one of the things that hasn't really been tried is after e6, bishop c4, or I should say it has been tried, and it seems to work quite well, is you play knight f6, and after queen e2, instead of playing for the Siberian trap with queen c7, and of course instead of playing the ideas involving a6, what we do instead is we transpose back into the d6 lines, but we've omitted the move a6, and the queen is placed on e2. And this apparently makes a huge difference. So what we can do is we can play d6 here. And this actually makes a lot of sense, because if we're going to play queen c7 and they can get away with e5, the only way we're going to prevent e5 is to do so mechanically, is to play d6. And what's interesting is the threat here for black is black actually just intends to play d6 and to play e5. Black wants to play e5 in this position and just get a position where he has a slight edge. And really the only thing that you have to worry about in terms of whether or not you're going to be able to play an e5 in this position is whether or not they can continue with knight g5 and get kind of that crazy looking thing. Now if they continue with the normal move, if they castle, you can of course play bishop e7 first, and then after rook d1, e5 is coming, and there is no threat of knight g5, you're going to castle, you can develop all your pieces, so like bishop g5, castles kingside, slight edge black all day long, life is good. You just have an extra pawn. Yeah, they got a weakness on d5, but you have an extra pawn. You get positions like this in the open Sicilian all the time, where white has a pawn on c2, you're playing the exact same position, but no pawn on c2. So this has to be slight edge black. The other way they could try this is they could put some immediate pressure on the position. They could play bishop f4, and now you could play e5. And now we have an identical position to that line that we could have achieved out of the d6 line, where white continues with this knight g5 move. But there are some minor differences. There's no pawn on a6, the king is not castled, and white has chosen to put his queen on e2. All of which actually seem to favor black, interestingly enough. So the idea here would be we'd go down the same line. We'd play e takes f4, knight f7, queen e7, knight h8, knight e5. And there is not going to be a queen a4 check in the middle of anything. So after white continues, and white can play aggressively, he could castle queenside, we're going to play g6, bishop to b3, we're going to play bishop g7, rook d2, we're simply going to take that knight on the h8 square, and at least according to the engine, this position is in fact slight edge black. And this is perhaps sort of the route that we need to go down. Now, d6 castles, I have another game here that went down this line. It was Nakamura versus Korobov, continued bishop e7, rook d1, e5, bishop g5, castles kingside, was in fact advantage black, and Korobov did in fact go on to win against Nakamura playing this particular line. So it's not just that I think this is slight advantage black, the results also seem to suggest that this is slight advantage black. Nakamura didn't have a great way to avoid this line, so maybe the rest of us don't have a great way to avoid this line either. But this is probably the path you want to go down if you want to get an advantage with the black pieces against the Smith-Morra gambit, and you want to accept that gambit. What you want to do is you want to play the e6 move order, and what you're trying to do is get to those old d6 lines where you've omitted the tempo pawn to a6. And this is really critical. You're saving that move. So we're going to have e6, we're going to have bishop c4, we're going to have knight f6, again, threatening that e4 pawn, basically forcing queen e2 instead of castles. And then we're going to have pawn to d6, and we're basically just threatening to play pawn to e5. And we're going to have castles kingside, we're going to have bishop e7, rook e1, and then e5. And even against bishop f4, the idea is, again, pawn to e5. And these positions should be slight edge black, and that is the best way you can try to get an advantage against the Smith-Morra by accepting it. I hope you found this video helpful, useful, learned something new about chess, and can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.